Chapter 7. How Mr. Johnson Developed His Scheme. In this part of the story, I'm going to show the steps that Mr. Johnson used in the fruition of his scheme. Frank met Mr. Johnson in December of 1996 when he came in to rent movies. It didn't take long for them to become good friends. Frank was friendly with all the customers, not just Mr. Johnson. Since the video store was called a mom-and-pop store, they liked to hire people from the neighborhood. Since the video store was very busy at this time, Frank asked Mr. Johnson would he like to work as an assistant manager in the video store. Mr. Johnson said, "Frank, I have a job at the flower shop, which is a half a block away, but I could work part-time." This was the start of Mr. Johnson's training. Mr. Johnson was eager to learn everything that he could about the operation of the video store, and especially the operation of the point-of-sale terminal. Frank only showed Mr. Johnson what he needed to know to open and close the video store. The owner was very pleased the way Frank and Mr. Johnson were running the business. The following is probably when Mr. Johnson got the idea to try embezzle money from the video store. One day, Mr. Johnson punched in someone's credit card number. The video store wasn't sure if this credit card was his. The sale was for $100, and Mr. Johnson put the slip in the cash drawer and took out $100 in cash. When Frank saw the slip in the drawer, he told Mr. Johnson, "You can't do that." Mr. Johnson asked Frank why. Frank told him that the sale you made was against the store and merchant bank policy. Frank showed Mr. Johnson how to avoid the sale and settle the point-of-sale terminal to zero. Frank told him that he had to put the $100 cash back in the drawer. Mr. Johnson put the money back and told Frank that he was sorry and he didn't want to get in trouble. Frank thought that this was an honest mistake. I would like to point something out about this transaction that I didn't like. I think Mr. Johnson was testing the system to see if what he did would be detected. Frank did notice that the slips had different account numbers. When Frank asked Mr. Johnson about this, he said he grabbed the wrong card and that all his cards are good. This incident happened about 2 months after Mr. Johnson was hired. This was an isolated incident to the video store then, but developed in something more serious later on. This was probably the infancy of Mr. Johnson's scheme. Everything seemed to be going good for a while. Then all of a sudden, customers start telling Frank that they were seeing Mr. Johnson in the video store after hours. Remember, Mr. Johnson had keys and all the codes and could come and go at will. When Frank asked Mr. Johnson about this, he said that he would sometimes double back to make sure that everything was done the way the owner wanted it done when she opened the store the next day. Frank didn't like his explanation and became suspicious of Mr. Johnson. Since Mr. Johnson and Frank were still good friends, Frank was hoping that his gut was wrong. Things were quiet for a while. Then one day, the owner noticed that the settlement showed there were 6 transactions, but she only had 4 slips. This happened on Mr. Johnson's shift. The owner told Frank to ask Mr. Johnson what happened. Frank asked Mr. Johnson about the discrepancy between the number of transactions and the number of slips. As usual, Mr. Johnson seemed to have an answer ready. This is what the man said. A customer bought 3 used movies for $25, and he punched in $250 by mistake. To correct this error, he voided the $250 sale and did the $25 sale again. Frank asked Mr. Johnson where are the voided slips. He said he didn't want anyone to know that he made a stupid mistake, so he tore up the slips. Frank accepted this explanation and told Mr. Johnson that the owner checks the settlement slips every day. Now that Mr. Johnson knew we were checking him closely, he watched his P's and Q's, and he was really doing a good job. Frank was proud of him, but behind the scenes, Mr. Johnson was preparing to strike again. Mr. Johnson made sure that the slips matched the transactions when there were real sales. Frank and the video store didn't have a clue. This author thinks that Mr. Johnson did the large sales after hours and settled everything to zero and destroyed all the slips. This way, Frank and the owner only saw what business that the video store actually did. That's why the deception that Mr. Johnson used was hard to detect. By the time the large sales showed up, Mr. Johnson had all the money that he intended to get and closed his Mac Visa account. After he withdrew the embezzled money, this way the banks couldn't transfer the money back to the video store. I decided now would be a good time of part of the story to give Mr. Johnson a mock trial. Based on the evidence that I have presented here, this would be a good time since Mr. Johnson just closed his Mac Visa account, which means that he got all the money that he intended to get. Assuming that Mr. Johnson was held for trial, the following is what this author feels would have went down. The following verdict was rendered after the witnesses have been cross-examined, evidence was produced by the video store, and Mr. Johnson's testimony was heard. Remember, the following verdict is what I believe would happen if Mr. Johnson was tried. The jury deliberated for about an hour and returned to the courtroom to render its verdict. The clerk tells the members of the jury that he understands that they have reached a verdict. And first of all, he will ask the foreperson as to the results of the verdict form. Then the clerk tells the other 11 persons that they will be asked whether they agree as a group, and you will be asked whether you agree with the verdict as announced by the foreperson. The clerk then tells these 11 jurors, if you agree with the verdict, you will say yes, and if you don't agree with the verdict, you will say no. Now listen carefully. If you agree, when you are asked collectively, you say yes, and if you don't agree, please let us know. The clerk asked the foreperson to please rise, and then he asked the members of the jury, have they reached a verdict? The foreperson says yes. The clerk now asks the foreperson, how do you find the defendant, Mr. Johnson, as to count 1, wire fraud? The foreperson says guilty, and to count number 2, bank fraud. The foreperson says guilty, and to count number 3, credit card fraud. The foreperson says guilty, and to count number 4, conspiracy. The foreperson says guilty, and to count number 5, money laundering. The foreperson says guilty. The clerk tells everyone to be seated and tells the members of the jury to listen to the verdict as the court has recorded it in the case of the United States versus Mr. Johnson. You find the defendant, Mr. Johnson, guilty in the manner and form as he stands indicted as to count number 1, and so say you all. The jury says yes. The clerk asked him, does anyone find him not guilty as to count number 1? There was no response from the jury. Then the clerk asked the jury as to count 2, your verdict is guilty, and so say you all. The jury says yes. Does anyone find him not guilty as to count number 2? There was no response from the jury. Then the clerk asked the jury as to count number 3, your verdict is guilty, and so say you all. The jury says yes. Does anyone find him not guilty as to count number 3? There was no response from the jury. Then the clerk asked the jury as to count number 4. Your verdict is guilty, so say you all. The jury says yes. Does anyone find him not guilty as to count number 4? There was no response from the jury. Then the clerk asked the jury as to count number 5. Your verdict is guilty, and so say you all. The jury says yes. Does anyone find him not guilty as to count number 5? There was no response from the jury. Remember the expression, silence is golden. I guess now you know where that quote originated from. Now the clerk tells Mr. Johnson to stand up. The judge reads the verdict and the sentence aloud in the courtroom. The judge tells Mr. Johnson, you have been found guilty on all 5 counts against you, and you are sentenced to serve 60 months in prison, which will give you plenty of time to reflect on what you did to a small business who trusted you and all the friendships that you betrayed by your criminal actions. When you are released from prison, you will serve 3 years of supervised release and have to pay full restitution in the amount of $46,000. Then the judge asked Mr. Johnson, does he understand what he had done? Mr. Johnson says, I understand, Your Honor. I hope you enjoyed this mock trial. I am pretty sure that Mr. Johnson would probably plead guilty to avoid a jury trial.